Hello and welcome to this tutorial video, I'm Neryl. If you've been waiting for this texture pack, then I'm happy to tell you that it's finally done, and right when I said it was going to be. This guide will mostly focus on getting the pack set up, but I'll talk a little bit about the project at the end, and there will be timestamps to make it easier to reference each step. If you saw the tutorial from a few years ago, a lot of things have changed since then. There's now an auto-installer made by a very talented programmer named Rosalie that will handle most of the emulator and plugin setup for you. The only thing it won't provide is a copy of the game. No ROMs will ever be distributed with this project, you have to get your own, and the easiest way to do that is to buy the game on a Wii U. I'm not going to outline the process here, but you can follow link 0 to a very easy guide for transferring your game to PC. There's no permanent hacking and it only requires an SD card. The resulting dump will look like this. Open the content folder and then, surprise, ROM to find your dump. You have to change the file extension to .z64 to make it compatible with an emulator. In America, the dump you get by doing this will be identical to the data on an old cartridge, so even though the Wii U emulator sucked, you don't have to worry about the ROM itself. If you want to do things this way, you have a limited window since the shop will start closing down soon, as they all do, taking all of its games with it. Someone should really make a video complaining about Nintendo's handling of classic games. Okay.
You've done this 10 times.
Alright.
Find something else to talk about, you fuck.
The auto-installer is the easiest way to get started. You can, of course, still set things up manually, but I'm only going to talk about that a little bit in the next section. The basic process hasn't changed since the last tutorial, so I'm going to focus on the installer here. Download the exe from link 1 and run it. Windows Smart Screen will probably warn you that it doesn't recognize the program. Click More Info and Run Anyway to bypass it. If you have any doubts about the software, it's all open source and you can review the code or even build it yourself if you want to. You'll be asked to select the locations for a temp folder and the emulator. Ignore the first option and just focus on the install directory. If you already have PROJECT64, don't try to overwrite that installation. The pack requires some specific settings and you'll want to keep it separate from a normal install. I recommend making a dedicated folder for emulators on your C drive, in my case I called it Games, and placing a folder for Majora's Mask N64HD there. The installer will ask if you want to create these directories. Say yes. You'll then get a list of everything the installer will download. The only thing you really have to worry about here is the pack version, and there are 3 to choose from. The standard pack is the version I made specifically for my US copy. It has all the textures I made along with some fixes and regional expansions provided by Ghostly Dark. The MLE version goes much further and provides support for as many languages, regions, and mods as possible. To keep things consistent between regions, it replaces some of my UI textures, as they were only intended for the US version and won't fit in with the others. If you're emulating a non-US ROM, this will provide the most seamless experience. Both packs will be about a 5GB download and will unzip to take up about 18GB of space. The size is due to the cache format Glide N64 uses, and there's no real way around it other than downscaling the textures. The third option for 1080p does just that and reduces the resolutions to get the pack down to 2GB. It's not really the version I'd like you to see, but if you're hardware limited, you can fall back on it. There are also packs available for other games, so feel free to try any that interest you. Once you've made your selection, the files will begin downloading to the temp folder. Remember again that this will be up to 5GB and may take a while. Once everything is complete, the installer will populate your folder with the plugins and ask you to delete the temp folder, which you should. Open PROJECT64 and right-click in the blank space to choose your ROM directory. Navigate to wherever you decided to put your ROM and it should show up in the game list now. Click Options and then Graphics Settings. Set your full screen resolution to match your monitor. You can also set the windowed resolution if you intend to play that way. The aspect ratio setting will depend on whether or not you want to use the widescreen patch. For now, choose Try to Adjust for widescreen with the default ROM. This option does a very good job of adapting games to widescreen, but it won't move the HUD. If you want the original ratio, choose 4:3. Turn MSAA and anisotropic filtering all the way up. You shouldn't have any trouble maxing these out on an average GPU. At this point you're done, although you can also visit the Hotkey tab to set up a texture toggle. This will allow you to see what the original textures look like at any given moment in case you're curious to see the difference. The last thing to set up is your controller. With your controller connected, click Options and then Input Settings. Click the Setup button on the right and then press the button you want to use for each highlighted action. It should automatically go through each button as you press it. If there's no response, close PROJECT64 and make sure your controller is connected before opening the emulator again, since it doesn't seem to support hot plugging. Since a lot of people ask, I use a Wii U Pro with the game. I mainly use it because the battery life made it easy to do texture work without worrying about charging, but it also suits the game pretty well. Once you've set your buttons up, you're ready to boot the game and see if it works. The installer is very reliable in my experience, but N64 emulators can be messy, so if you get an error at startup, try opening the options again and click Configuration to change your plugins. Change ASI audio to the default PROJECT64 audio, and if that doesn't help, try a different input plugin or change the RSP. If none of this works, you can ask for help on Discord. If the game does work, you can skip ahead to the patching section in Step 2. If you want to do things manually, I assume you know what you're doing and don't need a step-by-step walkthrough. If so, you can follow the old tutorial, as the file placements haven't changed since then, but there are a few things to be aware of.
You can't end sentences with prepositions!
Of which, to be aware. You can't use new Glide N64 builds because an accuracy improvement caused most of the textures to become misaligned and incorrectly tile. Why would an accuracy improvement do this? Because it turns out that's how the textures were mapped in the original game. I had to confirm this using Angry Lion, and someone also checked it on the original hardware. The mappings were always bad, and the old Glide N64 offsets just happened to fix all of them. Ghostly Dark hosts a fork of Glide N64 that tries to stay current while using the old texture behavior. You can find it in link 2. If you don't use this, a lot of textures will be blurry and broken, so be warned. If this requirement changes at some point, I'll post an update, probably in the form of a pinned comment below. Manually installing also gives you the option of using Mupen. I've had nothing but bad experiences with Mupen in the past, but Rosalie has made a new version with a GUI that's the same as PROJECT64. It isn't as fully featured as PROJECT64 and is missing cheats, but it should be a solid alternative if you want something that can run on Linux. Rosalie's Mupen with GUI can be found in link 3. The final installation option is Dolphin, using either the Collector's Edition or the Virtual Console. Once again, you'll have to dump your own copies from a Wii to get either game. The same pack works for both. The Collector's Edition was notoriously buggy and compromised in its audio and visuals, but stability can be improved by using Dolphin's CPU clock override. For the GameCube version, you'll want to set it around 300%. The Virtual Console is much better but lacks rumble, and if you plan to do framerate mods, you'll want to do a CPU override of about 175% for this one. With the overrides active, either version will be much more demanding than PROJECT64. The textures are also still in the process of being ported by Admentis, and the pack should be considered a beta for the time being. Download the latest Dolphin development build from link 4 and unzip the folder wherever you want it to go. If you created a games folder on your C drive earlier, this would be a good place for it. Run the emulator once and then set the path to your game directory. Now download the Zelda 64 Ultra HD pack from link 5 and choose the DDS version. After running Dolphin, it should have created an entry in your Documents folder. Open it and navigate to Load and then Textures. Unzip the texture pack and drag the contents into Dolphin's Textures folder. Open Dolphin's graphics settings and check Load Custom Textures in the Advanced tab. At this point, the pack is set up and should load when running the game. You just need to set your resolution in the Enhancements tab and configure a controller. For help with the basic settings, you can reference the guide in link 6. Next, we need to plant a kiss on this good boy. Sneak in real quietly and then At this point, you should have the basic ability to play the game with the texture pack, but there are more enhancements that I'd strongly recommend trying, starting with 3 patches. The main one is the Redux patch, which has a ton of improvements that make it hard to go back to the original. It puts the masks and ocarina on the D-pad, effectively giving you 7 usable items at once, and that alone is a bigger upgrade than the touchscreen in the 3D versions. You can also cycle arrow types when aiming, push blocks faster, and fix a lot of miscellaneous bugs. The widescreen patch improves on the adjust option by moving the HUD to the edges of the screen and allowing the storybook images to be presented in 16:9. There are a few compromises with this one. The Bomber's Notebook is currently stretched and the motion blur effect is also disabled, so if those things will bother you, you may want to pass on this one and stick with the built-in adjust option. If you do choose this mod, be sure to change Glide N64's aspect ratio to 16:9. The third patch is the new Link model made by Skylar. It has better texture mappings that allow for more detail and add some polygons for the hair and boots. This is pushing the limits of what the emulator can handle, and any more detail will cause the game to crash, so this is as far as model editing can currently go. To use these patches, download Patcher64 from link 7 and extract the contents. Instead of running the application, right-click on Patcher64 tool and choose Run with PowerShell. If you aren't using Windows 10, you can set up PowerShell using the README instructions in this folder. After a moment, the menu will appear and you'll be asked to navigate to your game. Patcher won't overwrite your ROM, but it's always a good idea to patch a copy rather than your original anyway. Navigate to either your 64 ROM or your Wii WAD file, and then set the game mode below to Majora's Mask. Click Select Options near the bottom to choose the mods you want. Redux is active by default, but you can toggle specific features on and off. The first page is filled with miscellaneous fixes to the game, like making the Icona fairy fountain match the stray fairy color, or restoring the complete Heart Piece theme, which was bugged and never played in the original. These are all optional and you can choose the fixes as you like. On the Graphics tab, you'll find the widescreen patch listed as the first option. For Dolphin users, the first option is grayed out and only the alt version is available due to differences between the formats. Down the list you'll find the improved link model option, as well as an off switch for the stars. There's no way to improve the pixelated appearance because they don't use textures. It seemed possible to use a hack to force a texture to be used instead of a pixel, but I wasn't able to find anyone who could mod that in. I think it's better to turn them off rather than have giant squares in the sky, but that's your choice. Skip to the Equipment tab and you'll see the option to make the Razor Sword permanent. I really recommend this one because it lets you appreciate how cool the sword is for a while instead of just rushing straight to the Gilded Sword. Finally, head to the Redux tab to set up the D-pad shortcuts. You can keep the default mapping or shuffle the masks around however you like. Just make sure that the D-pad isn't disabled in the options on the left side. You can also boost the block pushing speed here. When you're done, close the menu and choose Patch Selected Options. It may take a minute to finish. You should end up with a new ROM in the same directory as your old one. Make sure this file ends up in the same directory you chose for Project64. For 64, the modding is basically done, but you also have cheats available in the menu. With the game running, click System and then Cheats. The default ROM should have options to disable most of the HUD, which helps a lot when using ReShade, as well as a shortcut for creating fast elegy statues. These same codes unfortunately can't be used across every patch combination. Dolphin has an additional option for an experimental 30 frames per second. Visit link 8 and choose Code, and then download as zip. Extract or open the archive and navigate to your game version, GameCube or VC. There should be several INI files. Open Dolphin and check the ID it lists next to your version of the game, noting that the patched version will be different than standard. You'll need the INI file that matches this ID. Open the Dolphin folder in your documents and navigate to Game Settings, then drag the appropriate INI in. Overwrite an existing file if you have to. After this, you should be able to right-click on the game in your list, choose Properties, and then find the cheat codes listed in the Gecko tab. For 30 FPS, you need to check not only this box, but the two others listed in the AR tab. When playing the game, you can now toggle between 20 and 30 FPS at will by pressing minus. While it's fun to see the game at a higher frame rate, enemies and animations will go too fast in this mode, so it's not completely functional. If you play this way, you should expect to frequently switch back to 20 FPS to clear certain sections. These issues likely can't be fixed until a PC port is made. N64 MIP mapping was a joke, so shimmering is a big problem with the texture pack. Glide N64's anti-aliasing isn't powerful enough to address it, so you'll have to use driver-level AA to clean the image up. The process is basically the same with both vendors. For NVIDIA, open the control panel to Manage 3D Settings and click the Program Settings tab. Click the Add button and browse to your Project64 EXE. Change the anti-aliasing mode to override any application setting, and then change the next setting to 8x, or lower if your GPU isn't very fast. Also set the transparency to 4x or 8x. Click Apply and you should notice that the game is much less noisy on the next startup. For AMD, click the ellipses on the control panel and choose to add a game. Navigate to your Project64 EXE and then click the icon that appears in this menu. Click the Advanced tab and set anti-aliasing to override, and then choose 4x EQ to start with. AMD has the advantage of letting you choose the AA method, and super sampling does the best job. There's a slight blur effect, but the image will be completely smooth and clean. Unfortunately, AMD's AA can't be used at the same time as ReShade without breaking the graphics. So if you decide you want to use ReShade, you'll have to use Virtual Super Resolution to kill the shimmer instead. Once you enable the feature in your AMD panel, you'll see options higher than your native screen res appear in Glide N64 to downsample with, but you'll need a really good GPU to downsample and use ReShade at once. NVIDIA doesn't have this issue, so mix and match it with ReShade all you want. And speaking of ReShade, this is the final step to consider, and it's probably the most polarizing. The biggest shader adds path-traced shadows and global illumination to the game, adding a lot more depth and allowing some 2D textures to actually function as real lights. The majority of the time I think it looks good, but it comes with some compromises. It will still apply shading to the models when the game is paused, which makes the menus look ugly. If you want to be clever, you can use Steam or some other software to map the pause button as the same key used for disabling ReShade's effects, so that they shut off when opening the menu. It may also illuminate a little too much in the mountain areas, to the point where I had to dial the values back compared to where I wanted them for everywhere else. If you want a completely seamless experience, then this isn't for you, but if you want the best graphics possible and are willing to do some fiddling, it can dramatically enhance the look of some areas. The shader is currently a $5 tier reward on Marty's Patreon page. Considering that you can also use that shader in any other game you want, it's a pretty fair deal in my opinion. And to get this out of the way now, you don't need an RTX GPU, and the ray tracing cores won't be used even if you have one. If you don't want to pay, Marty also offers a free ambient occlusion shader that does some of the same work, just without path-traced accuracy. This MXAO shader doesn't enhance the lighting as much, but it's also less problematic. It doesn't impact the menus as badly and won't over-brighten, so it's a pretty safe choice. There's also the screen space reflection shader, which is really just a novelty that you can turn on in the rain to make the ground reflective. It can't tell when the ground is supposed to be wet, so it will always be active until you disable it. If you're willing to toggle a hotkey, it can be fun to turn on in the rain, but that's all that this one is for. The bloom and ambient light shaders are paired to add an atmospheric perspective type effect that resembles Wind Waker HD's bloom, but much less intense. It's mostly noticeable on objects along the skyline. My goal with these shaders isn't to radically change the look of the game or try to force it to look modern, because that's a losing battle. I've chosen moderate settings that add depth without disrupting the default visuals. You can crank them up or remove anything you want, my settings are just a suggestion. Download ReShade from link 9 and run the program. Browse to your PROJECT64 EXE and make sure to choose the OpenGL radio button. You'll then be presented with a list of shader packages. Uncheck the default options and choose QUINT, which has the bloom, MXAO, and reflection shaders, and also choose the legacy effects option at the bottom. Click OK and you'll be given the choice of which specific shaders to use. You can accept all of the QUINT set, but for the legacy set, uncheck all and then choose ambient light and display depth. Display depth is a helpful tool to test if you have depth access working correctly. Click OK to finish. Open PROJECT64 and run your patched game. You'll see a ReShade prompt asking you to press the home button. Do so and feel free to skip the tutorial. If the game looks completely broken, that's normal. Head to the OpenGL tab and check the buffer list. You'll see several options that end in FBO, meaning frame buffer object. You need to check the one option that is not FBO. AMD tends not to need this, but on Nvidia you seem to need to set it more often. Go back to the Home tab and load my configuration by clicking the preset box, then scroll down to Majora's Mask.ini and double-click. My settings are loaded, but the game is still borked. If everything is dark like this, click Edit Global Preprocessor Definitions and a new window will open up. Find the setting for Depth Input is Reversed and change it. It can only be 1 or 0, so just enter the opposite value. Click the button to reload the effects, which is very hard to see at the bottom of this window, and the screen should now be fixed. In some cases, the shading may also be upside down, in which case you can use the Depth Input is Upside Down definition to fix it in the same way. If you want to see the depth information directly, you can do it by clicking the Display Depth checkbox in your effect list, or by using MXAO's debug view to see the lighting that's being applied. You can now add the path tracing shader if you want to use it. You'll need accounts for both Discord and Patreon to acquire it. The shader will eventually become free and these steps won't be necessary, but for now you have to do it this way. Visit Marty's Patreon in link 10 and sign up for the $5 beta tier. As soon as you've done this, you'll be able to link your Discord account and gain access to the beta section of Marty's server. Look in the beta access channel for the latest Global Illumination shader release and save it. Inside you'll find a shader and texture folder. In your PROJECT64 install folder, you should have a ReShade shaders folder. Open it and you'll see the same two folder names. Add the folders from the zip to this directory and overwrite anything if prompted. You should now be able to boot PROJECT64 again and see the RTGI shader in your effect list. You can use MXAO and path tracing at the same time, but it's not necessary or a good idea, so if you want path tracing you should disable MXAO's checkbox. You'll also probably find that your card can't handle ray tracing at high resolutions, even though the game is 20 frames per second. If you plan to use this shader, visit the Frame Buffer tab in Glide N64's settings and change the frame buffer swap from Vertical Interrupt to VI Origin Change to gain a lot of performance. While you're there, double check that Copy Depth to Main Buffer is active, since it's needed for the effects to work. The only remaining step is to set a few hotkeys in the Settings tab. You'll want one to disable all effects at once, and if you want the reflection shader, then set a key to toggle that specific one on and off by right-clicking it on the Home tab. If you've gotten this far and everything is working, take a bow. You've enhanced an N64 game as much as I think is humanly possible in the year 2021. This pack started in November 2016 and took nearly 5 years of part-time work to finish. The total texture count is around 6,500, and with the MLE expansions by Ghostly Dark it goes over 10,700. The reason it took almost 1 year to finish after I said it was 96% done is that I was wrong, obviously, missing a lot more stuff than I thought, but there was also a lot of time-consuming work to do for the effect animations. There were also revisions done for most of the photo textures in order to make as much of the pack hand-drawn as possible. This isn't always about making a specific object look better as much as making it blend in more and getting more accurate to the original. Since the update last October, about 2,900 textures have either been drawn or replaced, which is about 45% of the pack. I received a lot of help during the final stretch from Rosalie, who made a new texture loading option that allows artists to instantly reload instead of waiting 5 minutes for an 18GB cache to be recreated each time. And that's in addition to creating the installer and a decent version of Mupen. Ghostly Dark and Admentus also helped out with an immense number of texture questions when I couldn't figure out where something was in the game. Many people requested support for other languages and regions, and it's entirely thanks to Ghostly Dark that those options are part of the pack. Admentus also created the patcher tool and is handling the Dolphin port, which is another thing that never would have happened if it were left just to me. The developer of Glide N64, GoNuts, also went pretty far out of his way to help with a lot of issues, some related specifically to getting this texture project to work the way I wanted. So if you like the results of this project, you should also thank all of these people for getting involved, and thank you for having enough interest to follow along and watch this. Now that that's out of the way, you probably want to hear about all the weird stuff I found while working on textures. Did you know that Zelda wears riding boots? I couldn't find the placement of this texture in the game, and Lynx tracked it to the boots, which were only ever visible for a split second in the Ganondorf escape scene. The older Beaver brother has invisible grass hair. The texture has always been there, but it was masked out to hide it. Maybe they used the younger brother model as a starting point and this is a remnant? Or they were toying with grass hair for both and changed their mind? The bombers have backwards ears. Every other character in the game uses basically the same ear texture, but for the bombers exclusively it's the wrong way around, which I have to assume was just a mistake that no one noticed. The torches in the game change the texture at their base depending on which mask you have on, and all of them are broken. According to Ocarina of Time, they're supposed to be a flat gray. This seems to be the behavior on N64 hardware as well, so it's not an emulator bug. It's been known for a long time that N64 games used photo assets, but it's only recently that people have begun to track a lot of them down. Ruvali's has found a few of the Majora's Mask source photos. I didn't use any of these in the pack, and they would make surprisingly bad photo choices at their full resolution anyway, but it is interesting to see how many photo details survived the downscaling process and then carried on into my drawings. A lot of the characters in the game use the same textures with few or no alterations. Gorman and the bomb shop clerk basically have the same eyes, and all of the target clerks are mostly the same model. The curiosity shop clerk and the item clerk also use the same textures, because they're the same guy. That's why the temp is there at night. I'm sure most of you know this, but somehow in the 20 years of playing I never put that together. I also never noticed that the shop gets abandoned on the third night. The ceiling doesn't seem to be attached, and the gap between the wall and ceiling is filled with part of the paper from the fish rubbing. For some goddamn reason. This one may be familiar if you've watched my other videos, but the walls of Icona Castle were supposed to be lined with this bird design, and for some reason it doesn't show up. I don't think they cut it for memory reasons because the texture still seems to load and dumps the same as everything else. One of the environmental artists hid his name and the date in the face of Stone Tower Temple. It's only visible on the texture itself. If you don't mail Anju's letter, the postman will send himself a letter on the second night telling himself that he's doing a great job. The bean seller's tattoo is the kanji for bean, because he's deep in that bean life and wants everyone to know it. Kotake is too short to see over the counter and has to stand on an orange box to boost herself up. If you re-enter the Deku Palace after learning the Sonata of Awakening, you can see the monkey being dipped in boiling water with a horrifying, dead expression on his face. If you revisit the Ocean Spider House after completing it, you'll find the panicked owner sheltering in preparation for the moon to hit. Finally, and maybe most shocking of all, is that if you hold the L button while shooting Tingle down and release it just as he begins to twirl, a nude mod is activated. That's it. Bye!